In school textbooks, the 18th century is an era of enlightenment and progress. But what if that's just a smokescreen? What if, 300 years ago, the world experienced a catastrophe that no one is supposed to know about? Old maps of vanished lands, cities sunk into the ground, archives with pages torn out. Why are historians silent? Who rewrote the past? And where can we find traces of the present-day flood that wiped civilization off the face of the earth? Don't take my word for it. See for yourself. In an archive in Amsterdam, there is a strange note from the late 18th century. It tells how, in one night, the water rose above human height, sweeping away everything in its path, and how, the next morning, the city was different, lifeless, as if it had never existed before. The author is an unnamed Dutch chronicler. This document is not studied in schools, is not mentioned in university courses, and is hardly ever cited. However, it is just one of many pieces of evidence that something global happened in the 18th century, something that people prefer to keep quiet about. If you carefully study the maps, chronicles, architectural anomalies, and climate data of that period, a picture emerges that resembles a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Only instead of the ancient Old Testament, these are events that took place just 300 years ago. Instead of myths, there is real eyewitness evidence and facts hidden in the shadows of official history. But why is no one talking about it? In school curricula, the 18th century is portrayed as an era of enlightenment, great discoveries, and philosophical progress. However, at the same time, massive floods, landslides, droughts, and earthquakes were sweeping across Europe and Asia. Historians usually explain this as local disasters, but if you put it all together, a much more frightening picture emerges. For example, in 1707, the Great Hungarian Flood occurred. The water level rose so sharply that dozens of villages were completely wiped off the face of the earth. In 1724, Lisbon and the coast of Spain were hit by a series of floods and sea storms, followed by destruction reminiscent of the aftermath of a tsunami. In Russia at this time, there were reports of building destruction and mass migrations, the causes of which official sources are silent about. What is particularly strange is that many cities seem to have been reborn after the mid-18th century. The architecture changed, and strange styles appeared, resembling attempts to recreate the old images. In many large cities, you can still find houses that are submerged up to their windows in the ground. Their lower floors are buried, as if the city had grown on the ruins of the old one. But archaeologists rarely give a precise explanation for this, referring to sedimentary processes. So here's the question. If so many traces point to a large-scale water disaster, why isn't it mentioned in textbooks? Why do historians studying the foundations of St. Petersburg or Moscow avoid the topic of sudden flooding? Why were houses in Western Europe rebuilt en masse in their original locations instead of simply being repaired? Is there a chance that we have forgotten something important? Or perhaps we were helped to forget? These questions will be the starting point for a journey through the mysteries, archives, and silent testimonies of the past. What you will see next is not theory. These are facts that simply did not fit into our convenient version of history. Ancient maps are not just artifacts, they are snapshots of how the world was once thought to be. But what if they contain not only geography but also traces of hidden disasters? Guillaume Delisle's map, created in the early 18th century, depicts North America with rivers that no longer exist and without some lakes that would later appear in all atlases. Later copies of the same regions show new coastlines and different proportions of the continents. The changes are explained by geographical refinements, but it is unlikely that refinements could have so radically altered the shape of the coastline. The most surprising thing is the disappearance of entire lands. On Fra Mauro,'s map, compiled from Arabic sources, a huge landmass is depicted south of India. Later, it completely disappears from European cartography. Where did it go? Why does no one write about it anymore? The same maps also show Tartaria, a giant country stretching from the Urals to the Pacific Ocean. In the middle of the 18th century, it suddenly disappears from the maps. Its lands are divided between Russia and China. But on previous maps, it was marked as a separate civilization centered in the area of modern Siberia. Why did it disappear? Where are its traces? The answer may lie in the aftermath of a global flood. If huge areas of land were submerged or destroyed by the flood, their physical disappearance would have caused them to be replaced. It is easier for historians to say that the cartographers of the past were wrong than to admit that they may have been right. The map by Philip Buscher looks particularly mysterious, with the modern coast of South America depicted without a number of bays and with a more even coastline. This is not just a mistake. It is a trace of flooding. If the water receded, the coast changed. But if the water came and stayed, it means that the coast was different before the disaster. There is another thing. Many maps dated before 1750 do not contain the familiar outlines of the coasts of northern Europe. After this date, there is a sharp change, as if a new world has been drawn, as if something happened. And finally, there are engravings. 18th century artists depict cities in which the streets are much lower than today. People are depicted against a backdrop of arches that disappear underground and columns that appear to have been higher but have been cut off by the ground. This is not fantasy. It is the reality of their time, which later disappeared from illustrations. If old maps lie, why are they kept in museums? If they don't lie, why are we taught different versions? A map is a frozen truth. But if the truth has changed, maybe it's not the map that's at fault? In many ancient cities in Europe and Asia, you can see the same anomaly. Buildings submerged in the ground up to their windows, doors, and sometimes even up to the cornices. These lower floors are most often called basements, although architecturally they are no different from full-fledged residential levels. Why did they end up underground? Why does no one ask this question? In Saint-It, Petersburg, Rome, Paris, and Istanbul, you can find buildings with windows that open onto the asphalt. However, these windows were once above ground level. Archaeologists explain this as natural soil subsidence. But can soil rise simultaneously and evenly across the entire planet? Many buildings after the mid-18th century seem to have been rebuilt, but with an eye to something that came before. Pseudo-antique architecture is spreading like an epidemic. Columns, obelisks, symmetry, all of this appeared overnight, all over Europe and Asia, as if someone had given the order to recreate something lost. Not to build something new, but to restore the old. From memory, from ruins, from rubble. On some buildings, traces of washed-away plaster and sand deposits can be seen at a height of 2 to 3 meters. Such traces can be found in Venice, Budapest, and Lyon. This is not just dirt. It is the trace of a powerful and all-consuming flow, and it was not local. In Russia, there is still debate about the true age of the Kremlin. Some researchers claim that the lower tiers of the towers were built long before the official date of foundation. The same applies to the Kazan Kremlin, the walls of Astrakhan, and the defensive structures in the Volga region. Old engravings depict buildings that no longer exist, and they did not simply collapse, they disappeared. Engineers working on the foundations of old buildings often encounter anomalous layers of soil. Between the brick levels, there are suddenly deposits of silt, shells, and remnants of wood brought by water. But archaeological reports rarely focus on these findings. They seem inconvenient. Lost cities are a separate chapter. In Central Asia, in the Aral Sea region, old maps show the outlines of settlements that do not appear in any modern database. Satellite images confirm that there are geometric structures under a layer of sand in these places. Who built them? When? And where did they go? Civilizations do not disappear without a trace. They leave behind ruins, texts, artifacts. But if all that remains of them are drawings on maps and strange underground foundations, perhaps it was not time that destroyed them, but water. So maybe the 18th century was not only the Age of Enlightenment, but also the Age of Oblivion? Perhaps, at the turn of the century, we lost something more than just cities? Perhaps we lost our memory. The history of the 18th century seems detailed and rich. However, if you start reading the chronicles, annals, and diaries of that time carefully, strange gaps appear. Periods in which nothing seems to have happened, or too much happened, but nothing has survived. For example, in many monastery archives in Central Europe, records break off between 1723 and 1731. Sometimes, instead of chronicles, there are blank pages or rewritten texts with identical words, as if copied from a carbon copy. In Poland, Austria, and the Czech Republic, it is almost impossible to find descriptions of specific events during this period. There are only mentions of diseases, migrations, and strange water that came from the sky. In China, the official chronicles of the Qing dynasty are sharply reduced in volume during the middle of the century. Natural disasters, unprecedented rains, and crop failures are mentioned, but key details are missing. It is as if someone deliberately chose what was worth remembering and what was worth forgetting. Arab and Persian sources point to dark years, when the earth rejected the sky, and people fled, leaving their homes in the water. Some texts are translated as allegories, but if we imagine that this is direct speech, it becomes clear that they were describing something much more significant than just bad weather. In the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 18th century, several archival reforms took place simultaneously. Under Peter the Great, thousands of old texts were destroyed. A new calendar system was created. The old calendar was abolished. Formally, this was done to unify Russia with Europe. But in reality, it was done to break with the past. Those who studied the pre-Patrian archives spoke of documents that did not fit into the new historical narrative. Most of these texts disappeared. They were burned in fires, sank during transport, or were lost in reorganizations. It was all too convenient. In some regions of the Caucasus and the Balkans, oral traditions about the Great Flood that came from the mountains have survived. Old people told how the sky opened up and the earth swallowed the cities. These stories were recorded by ethnographers as fairy tales. But why do they coincide in structure with stories from Scandinavia and Mongolia? History is a chain of events, but a chain with missing links cannot bear the weight. We cannot explain why the cities disappeared, why the buildings sank into the ground, why the maps were redrawn. And we especially cannot explain why we forgot all this. If we assume that a global catastrophe occurred in the mid-18th century, then the silence of the chroniclers becomes logical. Not because there were no events, but because there were too many. Perhaps history is not silent. Perhaps it is screaming, but we have been taught not to hear it. If we assume that a global catastrophe did indeed occur in the 18th century, the next logical question is, who hid it and why? Why are textbooks silent? Why does academic science avoid the subject? Let's start with the reform of chronology. At the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th centuries, Joseph Scaliger and later Isaac Newton established a linear scheme of world history based on a unified dating system. Their works formed the basis of the entire modern historical timeline. But few people know that before that, there were dozens of other systems of chronology, and many of them gave completely different dates to key events. Chronicles were destroyed or revised, chronicles were rewritten, and anyone who opposed the new chronology was declared an amateur. This was particularly active in the Russian Empire, where the old system of counting years from the creation of the world was abolished by decree of Peter the Great. At the same time, a large-scale purge of archives began. Coincidence? Strange processes were also taking place in the West. Thousands of books and manuscripts are still kept in the Vatican Library, inaccessible to the general public. Their contents are unknown, and many of them are classified under the pretext of protecting cultural heritage. Why? What could be so dangerous in them? Historians who attempted to research these topics in the 20th century often encountered censorship. Archives were closed, publications were not reviewed, and academic journals refused to print articles concerning anomalies in history. Even today, if you try to ask a question about the 18th century flood at an academic conference, you will be met with derision. But isn't science supposed to ask questions? It is also important to note that after the supposed catastrophe, the vector of civilization's development shifted dramatically. Industrialization began, mass production appeared, and capitalism became a global system. It was as if the world had been restarted. And in this new world, there was no place for memories of what had come before. If we imagine that a highly developed civilization existed before the catastrophe, perhaps Tartaria itself, then after the flood, the survivors could have tried to restore the old order. But they were stopped. The new world demanded a new history. And in order for it not to conflict with the past had to be forgotten. A conspiracy does not always consist of lying. Sometimes it consists of silencing the truth, removing sources, changing interpretations, rewriting dates, gradually, generation after generation, erasing memory. And if all this is true, then the world we live in is built not on knowledge, but on amnesia. Perhaps that is why we feel that something is wrong, not because we are being deceived, but because we instinctively remember that things were different. After the mid-18th century, the world seemed to wake up a different place. The climate became unstable, the political map unrecognizable, and cultural codes broken. The change of eras is almost physically palpable. But who said it was just a coincidence? Immediately after the supposed catastrophe, a series of rebellions, revolutions, and reforms began. The 7 Years' War broke out in Europe, the independence movement began in America, and traditional dynasties began to collapse in Asia. These events seem unrelated, but they all occur between 1750 and 1790. This is the very period in which the supposed global flood fits. Nature also changed. Crop yields declined, wind patterns shifted, and unusually cold winters and dry summers began. Scientists refer to this as the Little Ice Age. But why did it happen then? Why was the climate milder before and then suddenly became so harsh? Megalithic structures around the world fall into disuse. Many of them are covered with silt, earth, and sand. Some call them abandoned sites, others technological dead ends. But perhaps they were abandoned because the civilization that built them disappeared. With the disappearance of Tartaria, the great northern power depicted on dozens of maps, a new era dawns. Russia absorbs its lands, Europe forgets its existence, and China redraws its borders. There is no real explanation for this disappearance. How could an entire civilization disappear without war, without epidemic, without even a hint of resistance? Perhaps the answer lies in the water. Cities begin to be rebuilt according to new standards. Regular layouts, straight streets, and identical facades appear. It is as if someone has decided to start from scratch. Indeed, many cities are literally being rebuilt on top of the ruins and old foundations. St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, London, all of them are undergoing large-scale reconstructions that, strangely enough, leave almost no traces of the old layers. Why? In culture, Freemasonry, secret societies, and esoteric schools begin to flourish. Symbols that were previously considered taboo become fashionable. Why then? Perhaps they held knowledge about the former world. The economy is also transforming. The Industrial Revolution begins, banks, factories, and new forms of labor appear. All this seems to arise out of nowhere, without any logical preparation. Where did the resources come from, if the previous wars supposedly depleted everything? Or did they simply come from another civilization? So, the world entered a new phase. But the price of this phase is oblivion. Oblivion of the past, of catastrophes, of civilizations. We accepted this as inevitable because we knew no alternative. And now, perhaps, it is time to remember. Why would the memory of such a grand catastrophe be erased? Perhaps because it disrupts our familiar worldview. Because if it happened, then everything we were taught may not be what it seems. The traces of the flood have not disappeared. They are here, under our feet, in the underground floors of old houses, in forgotten foundations and discrepancies in old maps. They are in architecture, which seems to imitate something lost, in strange restorations and reconstructions, where what is being restored is not what was, but what is convenient to show. Modern cities harbor the ghosts of a bygone era. Just look at the technical floors, the old basements, the deepest levels of the metro. Why do the windows in some metro stations lead into the ground? Why do the stairs in the basements go down 2, 3, or even 4 levels? To nowhere. Who built them, and why is there no official information about them? The landscape has changed. In Siberia, where there used to be densely populated areas, there are now empty spaces. In places where old maps show cities, there are now steppes or swamps. Archaeologists are in no hurry to excavate. Historians make no mention of it, as if that's the way it should be. The word flood is associated with ancient myths, Noah, Atlantis, Gilgamesh. But if such events could have happened thousands of years ago, why couldn't they have happened more recently? Why is the idea of an 18th century flood considered absurd, even though there is indirect and direct evidence everywhere? We have been taught that history is linear, that civilization progresses from simple to complex, from primitive to highly developed. But what if it is cyclical? What if every few hundred years there is a reset, a restart, a catastrophe, and we build again, no longer on sand, but on the ruins of the old world? Memory is the most vulnerable part of any culture. It can be rewritten, erased, replaced. 3 or 4 generations are enough. Who remembers what the streets of Paris looked like before Haussmann's Great Reconstruction? Who remembers that there are levels beneath New Orleans that were built long before the United States was founded? The question is not whether there was a flood. The question is why we are not allowed to remember it. Why does any mention of it provoke irony, rejection, and the label pseudoscience? Perhaps because the truth is dangerous, or because it is too inconvenient. Our task is not to believe blindly. It is to ask questions, to search, to doubt, to look at a map and see not only the coastline, but also what was once under the water. Perhaps this is how true awakening begins, not with an answer, but with an attempt to remember what has been forgotten.